I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
Roosevelt and his advisors came into office with ideas about how to end the Depression. Roosevelt had no clear agenda and he did not have a strong political ideology. He instead argued, the country needs bold, persistent experimentation. Above all, try something. Roosevelt sent bill after bill to Congress between March 9 and June 16, 1933, which became known as the 100 Days. Congress passed 15 major acts to resolve the economic crisis. These programs made up what is called the First New Deal. With the First New Deal, Roosevelt passed the Emergency Banking Relief Act within a week after he took office. This law required that all national banks needed to be surveyed by federal examiners. Roosevelt also required the financially stable to be issued with Treasury Department licenses. Roosevelt passed this act so that he could regain the nation's trust in banks because the new programs would only work if the nation's banks reopened. On March 12, Roosevelt said on the radio to the nation, I assure you that it is safer to keep your money in a reopened bank than under the mattress. The next day, many deposits were made and the amount was much greater than how many people withdrew money. This put an end to the banking crisis. Once people started to trust banks again, Roosevelt continued the steps to help the nation get out of the Great Depression. With his Emergency Banking Relief Act, Roosevelt wanted to take the dollar off the gold standard. To do this, Congress passed a law in June that only allowed contracts to be paid in legal tender. Gold was no longer available for the nation to demand or to use for paying because it was not allowed. Instantly after the law was passed, the rate of inflation began to rise. Roosevelt wanted this. His intention for the inflation was to help people in debt and people like farmers who were struggling with the low prices of their goods. Roosevelt called this inflation reinflation because in his mind, he thought that the dollar was overvalued. People who had debts would now be able to pay them off easier because when inflation rises, the value of money decreases. Once the dollar's value fell enough, Roosevelt decided that it was fine to get back on the gold standard. Roosevelt also set a new value for gold, which was $35 per ounce. Many of the advisors of Roosevelt's wanted to get further and they pushed for new regulations for the banks and the stock market. With Roosevelt's agreement, they created the Securities Act of 1933 and the Banking Act of 1933, which was also known as the Glass-Steagall Act. The Securities Act made requirements for companies that sold stocks and bonds be able to give completely truthful information to the investors. The Glass-Steagall Act was able to separate commercial banks from investment banks. This meant that depositors would no longer have to worry about their money being put into stocks. In the Glass-Steagall Act, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was made to give government insurance for bank deposits, and this made the public go back to trusting banking systems. For the New Deal, the states' governments had the responsibility of regulating banks, and now banks have a federal or state charter and they help the banks with regulations. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation is something that is still used and exists today. It is in charge of watching over 4,500 banks, and they make sure that there are no issues with the financial regulations and consumer protection laws. During Roosevelt's first year in office, he convinced Congress to pass an astonishing array of legislation. The First New Deal did not restore prosperity, but it reflected Roosevelt's zeal for action and his willingness to experiment. Banks were reopened, many more people retained their homes and farms, and more people were employed. The most important result of the First New Deal was a change in spirit of the American people. Roosevelt's actions had inspired and restored Americans' faith in their nation. President Roosevelt was very popular during his first 2 years in office. The New Deal programs had created more than 2 million jobs. The nation's total income was about half of what had been in 1929. The Second New Deal. In 1935, Roosevelt launched a series of programs which is now known as the Second New Deal. He made the Second New Deal to generate greater economic recovery. Amongst these new programs was the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, the New Deal's largest public works program. Between 1935 and 1941, the WPA employed 8.5 million workers and spent $11 billion to construct about 650,000 miles of roadways, 125,000 public buildings, 835 airports, more than 124,000 bridges, and more than 8,000 parks. One WPA program called the Federal Project No. 1 financed artists, musicians, theater people, and writers. Artists created murals and sculptures for public buildings. Musicians set up orchestras and smaller musical groups. Playwrights, actors, and directors wrote and staged plays, and writers recorded the stories of those who had once been enslaved and others whose voices have not been heard. Failures of the New Deal. The New Deal implemented various programs and initiatives aimed at alleviating the efforts of the Great Depression, but it also faced significant challenges and criticism. Despite its efforts, the New Deal didn't fully address the needs of all groups affected by the Depression. Many marginalized communities, such as African American tenant farmers and Native Americans, faced discrimination and exclusion from the New Deal benefits. Despite the creation of various relief programs, unemployment remained high throughout much of the New Deal era, indicating a failure to provide sufficient support for those affected mostly by the Depression. Some New Deal programs perpetuate racial disparities, such as the exclusion of African Americans from certain job opportunities and the unequal distribution of benefits in housing and agricultural policies. While the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, aimed to raise farm prices by reducing production, it led to the displacement of tenant farmers, particularly the African Americans, without adequately compensating them. The program favored landowners over tenant farmers, exacerbating inequality. Large-scale water management projects such as the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, and the Central Valley Project, the CVP, brought benefits like flood control and electricity, but also resulted in environmental damage and displacement of communities. The New Deal was a response to the worst economic crisis in American history. The United States suffered from the ravages of the Great Depression. Franklin D. Roosevelt took office in March 1933. He proposed a structural reform that could protect people in future crises, but the New Deal was never a coherent, interconnected effort to deal with the various dimensions of the Great Depression in a systematic way. It was a multi-faced attempt to deal with different elements of the conflict. The New Deal enjoyed some notable accomplishments, even if it failed to promote full-scale economic recovery. The New Deal programs were financed by tripping federal taxes from $1.6 billion in 1933 to $5.3 billion in 1940. Excise taxes, personal income taxes, inheritance taxes, corporate income taxes, holding company taxes, and so-called excess profit taxes all went up. But the most important source of the New Deal revenue were excise taxes on alcoholic beverages, cigarettes, matches, candy, chewing gum, margarine, fruit juice, and more everyday things. This meant that the New Deal was substantially financed by the middle class and poor people. Until 1937, the New Deal revenue from excise taxes exceeded the combined revenue from both personal income taxes and corporate income taxes. It wasn't until 1942, the midst of World War II, that income taxes exceeded excise taxes for the first time under FDR. Consumers had less money to spend and employers had less money for growth and jobs. The New Deal taxes were a major job destroyer and unemployment averaged 17% higher. Business taxes meant that employers had less money for hiring and growing. Social Security excise taxes on payrolls made it more expensive for employers to hire people, which discouraged hiring. Other New Deal programs destroyed jobs too. For example, the National Industrial Recovery Act cut back production and forced wages above market levels, making it more expensive for employers to hire people. African Americans alone were estimated to have lost some 500,000 jobs because of the National Industrial Recovery Act.